All right. Well, hello, friends, and welcome. My name is Doug Bouws, Vice President for Client Services with Money for Ministry, and your host for our webinar today, Rethinking Recurring Giving, the Subscription Economy, and Fundraising. I am so glad you're here. Our audience today includes fundraising professionals from schools and colleges and rescue missions. There's broadcast ministries represented, mission sending organizations, discipleship ministries, and so much more. So glad to have so many of you with us today. At Money for Ministry, we serve faith-based and specifically Christian organizations that are spread across the evangelical, the mainline Protestant, and Roman Catholic traditions. We're also joined today by charities who are friends of our sister company, Canopy Resources. Canopy, they bring the proven Money for Ministries process for planned giving growth to an even wider range of nonprofit organizations. So glad you're all here to join us. As folks continue to log on, I just want to go over a few items of interest, some housekeeping details. There are two buttons at the bottom of your screen that you want to be aware of. There is a question and answer box. Click that button and you can submit questions as we go. If I hear something or see something that looks like it's relevant to what we're talking about at that moment, I may interrupt Dave, our presenter today. But we've also left lots of time at the end, and we really look forward to letting you be part of the discussion today through those questions. So invite you to participate in that. There's also a chat window. There's a button. If you click that chat window button, it will open. This is a great place for you to engage with each other as we go. And I was thinking about our time together today and what it's like for many of you right now. So fall is right around the corner. Do I need to say that? Can you believe September 1 is already later this week? But for many of you, that means you're entering a season where your work really kicks into high gear. And I'm curious, I wonder, it's easy for you to say everything is important, and there's a lot of things I got to attend to in the next 3 to 4 months. But I'm wondering, what's the one thing, the number one priority for you between now and Christmas that's going to be your focus? And I invite you to go ahead and type that in the chat right now. Give us a window into kind of who you are and what your focus will be as you enter this fall season. This webinar is being recorded. We often get that question. And so if you are registered, you'll get a recording. If you're listening, you'll get a recording. If you want to share it with people on your team who couldn't be here today at this time, we invite and encourage you to do so. So look for that shortly after the webinar. We'll get that to you. Great to see some of you writing in the chat, end of year appeals, holiday giving, increasing personal contact, encouraging recurring giving. Good. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Feel free to keep adding as we go. That just gives us, again, a window into who's here and what your focus is as you look ahead to fall. So I think we have a really fascinating topic to consider today. I'm really excited about it. I have so appreciated the insight that Dave has already given to me in this area of fundraising. And I think so many of the principles that you're going to hear about today have great alignment for principles that make for a great planned giving program as well. So we'll talk a little bit about that in our time together. Well, I want to welcome our guest today. He's a consultant, a speaker, a writer, founder of Imago Consulting, and his name is Dave Raley. Dave loves innovation and loves to work with leaders who love innovation because he sees it as the path to profitable growth. Over the last 2 decades, Dave has worked with more than 100 organizations. He's the author of the Wave Report. It's a weekly report on waves to watch. So if you like to surf, be sure to subscribe. No, it has to do with fundraising and leadership. We'll talk about that as well. But if you're not subscribed, you should. So more on that later. Well, welcome, Dave. We are glad that you're with us. Thanks so much. I know you've got a lot to share, so I'm going to turn things over to you.
Thank you, Doug. It's really good to be with you all. I was telling Doug as we were preparing for today's seminar, I think my first interaction with Money for Ministry would have been almost 20 years ago. So wow. Just love the work that you all do. And We might talk about it a little bit in the Q&A, but just some of the early epiphanies that you helped me to have as a marketer and fundraiser in how I might have a role in helping to drive and grow planned giving. And so it's been a fruitful relationship. And so when we were talking earlier this year about bringing this topic to the audience, I thought, man, what a win-win. So I do think there's some really powerful parallels. So excited for it.
Yeah, thanks so much.
All right. Well, let's go ahead and dive in. I'm going to start us with a question. I see we warmed up the chat, so I'm going to try to pull the chat up so I can see it too, because I have a question for everybody. What do you think about when you hear the word subscription? If we were all together in a room, I'd have you break up in small groups, but let's just do it in the chat. Just what's the first thing that comes to mind? What do you think about when you hear the word subscription? Be bold, be honest. Sometimes there are some negative connotations, and that is, I would welcome those. So magazines, monthly commitment, podcast, money. Yeah, slight groan. Thank you, Erica, for your honesty. BarkBox. Okay. Oh, Rebecca, we've talked about BarkBox. Easy, cable TV, monthly magazines, commitment, Spotify. Nobody has said too many yet. Nuisance. There we go. Okay. All right, good. Love it so much. I commit to every month. I think that's something we're going to talk about today. Like subscriptions are require ongoing value, right? They're not just something that you just do because you're a consumer. And I think there's some lessons we can learn on the fundraising side of things. Sometimes hard to end. Good point, Tina. Yeah, I had one of those on hold last week or 2 weeks ago for about 35 minutes. Never got through. It's weird how they made it really hard to cancel. Yep, absolutely. Okay. So I think as you can tell from today's topic, we are going to really draw some parallels between the world of for-profit consumer and business subscriptions and what's been happening in the world of fundraising. More on that in a moment. In the meantime, as Doug mentioned, I am the founder of Imago Consulting. Really, my focus with organizations is to help them grow through sustainable innovation. And part of that, as I've seen in the last now 20 years of working with nonprofits and with ministries, is this realization that you can't just optimize for today. You have to innovate for tomorrow, and vice versa. You can't just innovate for tomorrow without optimizing for today. And so I do write a weekly report called the Wave Report. We'll talk about that towards the end of our time. And I regularly cover topics that I think are important for leaders of nonprofits as well as businesses, candidly, that they should be paying attention to. Things like the subscription economy, artificial intelligence, trends in consumer goods, what we can learn from other businesses. And then the last piece is that I am the co-host and co-founder of a podcast called the Purpose and Profit Podcast. And what myself and my co-host Carly Berna talk about each episode is what are the ideas, surprising ideas at the intersection of causes and brands. So on some episodes, we'll have a leader from a cause. We've had folks from International Justice Mission, from Charity Water, and other episodes we might have somebody from a brand. We've had folks from Disney and Domino's Pizzas, and so what can we learn about innovation in the nonprofit sector from Domino's Pizzas? So fascinating conversations, but all towards just equipping leaders to understand what are the waves that are coming. And the reason this is important to me, and you've all seen this chart before, maybe it didn't look like this, but the old S curve, every organization, every product is somewhere on this curve. Sometimes organizations can be multiple places on this curve, depending on their, if you think of like Apple computers, they have, laptops and iPads and iPhones, and you can plot different places on this curve. But the reality is this is just an inevitable kind of law of thermodynamics in terms of organizational life cycles. No organization, no church, no nonprofit is immune from this realization that you go from infancy to growing and then ultimately slowing, plateauing, and decline. But the good news, and the reason why innovation is so important in every sector, is because you don't have to stay that way. The opportunity is to create new S curves. And so innovation is a core behavior to doing that. And that's what I specialize in. So we're going to talk about one of those S curves that I'm seeing in the space and has really been happening, I would say, for at least 5 years now. I've been involved with sustainable recurring giving for 20 years, but really these changes that we're going to talk about today are a few years into taking place. And so hopefully you'll come away today with some thoughts on how to actually implement those and how that might impact your organization and your recurring giving. So what we're going to start with is some consumer trends. As I've mentioned, I think we can learn a lot from the consumer world. And so I'm going to go through a few consumer trends, and then we're going to match those up with some donor trends. So first of all, in the consumer landscape, customer loyalty is declining. Getting customers to buy another widget has become more expensive and more difficult than ever before. So brand loyalty, customer loyalty, repeat purchase behavior has become more challenging than ever before. And that's largely because of the proliferation of choice. There's just so much out there, and there's good options, and people have, brands and products have become more mature. And so there's just so much competing attention. So at the same time, while repeat purchase behavior has been declining, in the world of automated payments, those have become much more commonplace. This is a kind of a maybe complicated graphic from the banking industry, but what this basically shows is that today, of all recurring automated payments, 48% of those are what are known as discretionary. What that means is, if 10 years ago you looked at my bank statement and looked at those payments that were automated each month, that would have been things like the power bill, the phone bill, my mortgage payment. Those are what are known as non-discretionary payments. Like, I don't really technically have much of a choice. If I'm gonna, get phone service, I have to pay the phone bill. And so this graph would have looked much more different 10 years ago than it does today, where nearly half, in this case, of all automated payments are things like your Netflix subscription or BarkBox, as we talked about, is subscriptions. And so that has become a very commonplace thing. I realize I'm preaching to the choir. In fact, if we were all in a room, I would do this as a show of hands, but so you don't have to raise your hand. I can't see you, but just mentally check these boxes. I'd like to know if you have subscriptions in one of these areas. So does anybody here, I don't know, have any subscriptions in the area of video entertainment? Thank you, Doug. Doug, you can be my, I can see you. Netflix, Hulu, Disney Plus is a favorite in our house. Peacock. I mean, there's just so many different video entertainment subscription services. Music streaming. I just did a 2-part piece on how Spotify is a perfect example of the evolution of what subscriptions have become today. Spotify, Pandora, Apple, iTunes, subscription service. Software. That's one that I resisted for a long time, but you've got things like Adobe, Creative Cloud, Microsoft Office 365, Quicken. That one kills me, having to subscribe to accounting software. But we have the subscriptions. Subscription boxes. We already heard from Rebecca about BarkBox. There's a lot of subscription boxes today. Of what people are passionate about or interested in, or even just convenience. Books. When I ask people if they subscribe to books, and I don't always get a ton of hands, and then I say, but Audible counts, and then usually about 85% of the room's hands go up. I don't know what I would do without my Audible subscription. That thing gets a lot of playtime in my house. Fitness. That's your typical gym membership, but that's also fitness apps and nutritional apps, different things like that. News, groceries and meal delivery, especially since the pandemic. Vehicle ownership. Did you know that you can subscribe to vehicle ownership? And I don't mean leasing, by the way. A lot of people think, oh, that's a lease. It's like, no, no, no. Actually, multiple vehicle manufacturers now have subscription products where you can subscribe to, the gold level of the Jeep, membership or whatever. And, if it's a nice weekend and you want to take a vehicle up to the mountains, you just swap out your vehicle using your subscription service. And so a lot of different things, even in that space. But my favorite is subscribing to your doorbell. Doug, you subscribe to your doorbell?
I do. Yes, I do.
What, if I might ask, what subscription do you have?
I have Ring.
Ring. Oh, that's our next slide. So
Yeah.
if you would have told me, by the way, 10 years ago, hey, Dave, there's going to be a world in the future in which you will pay the doorbell company $10 a month for the privilege of using your doorbell, I would have said, one, I have no idea what this future world is. And two, like, don't sign me up for that. I don't want that. By the way, Doug, I've made this.
Doesn't it?
Yeah.
Because of all of the packages that show up on my front door, it makes it necessary. Or right, but it's all, I guess, I don't know if that's subscription, what Prime, whatever.
Yeah, it's absolutely ongoing value. It's, but and I used to, by the way, make this joke long before I had a video doorbell. And then my wife pointed out, while you travel, I don't really appreciate having to answer the door without knowing who's there. And so now we are subscribers, not to Ring, but to Arlo, which is one of the other video doorbells. But suffice to say, subscriptions have really impacted nearly every area of our consumer and business lives. And there are even apps today that exist to basically keep track of all your subscriptions so you know what you're paying for. Because as one of our commenters made a point earlier on, it's about the value I'm getting on an ongoing basis. It's like, is this something that I'm really using? And I'm sure we've all had those moments where like, I haven't used that in 6 months. Why am I still paying for that? Right. And so that's definitely a part of our reality today. In 2022, the average American had 6.7 subscriptions, which was up, by the way, significantly from even just 2019 with 4.2 subscriptions. And so this is just a dominant part of the consumer landscape, and it's been good for business. Subscription-oriented businesses have grown over the last 10 years at nearly 5 times the annual growth rate of the traditional S&P 500. And so certainly businesses have gotten on that train. They've understood that there are core benefits to doing subscriptions. It's not all roses, by the way. Post-pandemic, there have been a lot of subscriptions that have struggled because ultimately they're not providing ongoing value. That sort of value for the ongoing relationship has not been there. But by and large, it's been a boon for organizations. So all that together really encapsulates what is called the subscription economy. And that is the rise of recurring subscriptions in every area of consumer and business life. Consumers are buying access to always on, anywhere, memorable experiences, ongoing value, and personalized service. So it's become a core part of the daily life we have today. I'm not going to unpack these in detail just for time's sake, but I wanted to make sure to include these here, and I'm going to just cover them briefly. The subscription economy really has ultimately created 6 different shifts in the way individuals look at their relationship to a recurring transaction like a subscription. And that's moving from the idea of a transaction, I buy a widget, to an engaging experience. It's moving from the idea of ownership to access. As I mentioned previously, Spotify, if you would have told me, 10, 12 years ago, hey, Dave, you should pay, the music company $12 a month to get access to the world's music, I still wouldn't have bought it. I would have said, no, I want to own my music. I have this collection of CDs, I don't want to like rent music because then I'm just going to lose access if I stop paying. And so it's far more than just access to the world of music. It's about engaging experiences. It's about the next point, which is moving from being an anonymous buyer to a known customer. The more data that organizations have, the more they can tailor the experience. Moving from a periodic interaction to ongoing value. We've talked about that a couple of times. And then ultimately, practically it's moving from single purchases to recurring payments. But I think too often we focus on the recurring payment side of things and just think, well, the rest of that stuff's just fluff. We just need to get people to check the box to give monthly, for example, or to purchase our product monthly. And that just doesn't work that way. You've got to meet all of these other criteria. And then finally, moving from one or two-way communication to really creating a sense of community, but being a part of a broader whole. So we'll bridge that over to the nonprofit area as we talk about the subscription economy and fundraising. So I've got good news and I've got bad news. I don't know if anyone's ever, asked you that question, like, do you want the good news first or do you want the bad news first? Well, for me, I'm going to choose the bad news first. So let's start with the bad news. The bad news is that donor counts overall, holistically, have continued to decline. And this is all donor counts. The next several slides are from the Fundraising Effectiveness Project. You can look up the results, but basically Q2 year-over-year results. And the bottom line is this is not something that's new to the world of fundraising by and large, but it has something, especially 2022, for organizations coming out of some of the bumps and significant lifts that they saw in 2020 and then 2021 has been really a challenge. And specifically, the decrease in donors has come from really a collapse in the small or general donor category and the sub $500. So if we dig into that a little bit deeper, you can see here that if you look at the different types of donors under $100, $100 to $500, and so on, that the largest both percentage declines have been in the micro and small donor pools, as well as those represent 86% of all donors. So not only is the percentage decline larger, but the actual total number of donors is significantly larger as well. So it's a double whammy. And that is really a significant challenge for organizations. At the same time, retention is suffering. Retention was expected to decrease by 4.2% here, in Q2, and that's following last year's decrease. So, and if you look at the retention again by size of donor, once again, the biggest impact is in the retention of small donors. So this has been a challenge. This is not a new challenge, but it's certainly been particularly acute over the last 18 months for nonprofits. But there's some good news. The good news is that recurring donors are resilient. If you look at those same stats and you look at the number of the retention across different donor frequencies, you can see that recurring donors were also down in the same period, but down much less than their single gift counterparts. In fact, some of the organizations I was working with at the time when this data came out, they had seen their retention rate in some cases move from 94% to 92% for recurring donors, and I'm like, I'll take 92%. I'd rather have 94, but that's much better than the alternative reality with retention on the single gift counterpart. At the same time, on the good news front, recurring donors are valuable. This data is here from Nonprofit Pro. Mean gift size of organizations is consistently around the $63 mark. Recurring gifts are more likely to be initiated in January than December, which is a nice follow-on to what a lot of you even talked about in terms of your priorities between here and December. Recurring donors have a high retention rate. And this is especially key for those of you that are really invested in planned giving. And this is one of those crossover areas that recurring donors are significantly more likely to leave an organization in their will or make a legacy gift to an organization. That's something, Doug, we've talked about for years in terms of the power of planned giving is about the longevity of that relationship. And then ultimately what happens in an estate gift situation, a legacy gift situation.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Doug.
Well, I just can't echo it more. I mean, we find ministries that have strong recurring donors probably also have strong legacy prospects, and vice versa. It works both ways. There's there's so much about a recurring donor and that sense of long-term value that then transfers over into that legacy gift, because when we work talking about extending impact. So I just can't underscore enough the congruence between the two.
Yeah. Yeah. Long-term value is paramount. That's one of the single biggest mistakes I see nonprofits make, is to basically compare their single gift program and their recurring giving program on short-term metrics. Well, I can tell you which one's going to do better in the short term, but I can also tell you which one's going to do better in the long term. And the average, this is a conservative number, the average long-term value is typically 3 to 5 times higher than single gift donors. I've seen as much as 9 times higher. So depends on the organization and the maturity and sophistication of their recurring giving program, but it's a substantial increase. So if you think about it, if a recurring donor, for example, costs maybe twice as much or 50% more to acquire, but then they're worth 3 times as much or 5 times as much, you can start to do some math to say like, oh, well, that's more expensive, but then I get 3x the value, right? And so those are the kinds of things that organizations need to be thinking about when they're making decisions on
Can I ask a clarifying question on that? So if
Yeah,
I'm a single
absolutely.
donor, and even if I make one gift a year every year, but I'm not part of that recurring automated, I'm likely to be less valuable over the long run. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, when you take in, by the way, long-term value is such a differently calculated number for a lot of folks. But if you look at 5-year value or 3-year value, or basically over the long term, and you take a look at the total giving, long-term giving from your single gift donors, whatever that number is, $300, $500, I've seen, a lot of different ranges. You're then seeing 3 to 5x that in terms of the same type of donor, but that's giving recurring. And then the kind of cherry on top is that sustainer donors are often some of the best single gift donors, because they tend to give single gifts throughout the year, especially at key times. And so typically I'll see an organization that brings in, say $1 million a year in sustaining revenue, just to make the math easy. Meaning $1 million of recurring gifts in a year from those donors. Those same donors will give another $250,000 in single gifts, because they're the most bought into your mission. They're the most loyal, ongoing core supporters. And so it's really a tremendous opportunity. However, there's some bad news. We're going to bring back a little bit of bad news. Historically, there have really been the vast majority of nonprofits that have not been able to tap into building a large, growing, recurring giving program. Some of you have probably been listening to me the last few minutes thinking, nice to say, Dave, but we don't have child sponsorship in our organization, or we don't do staff support, or some of the more classical recurring giving programs. So historically, there have been 3 types of sustainer programs. The first is what I would call one-to-one sustainer program, and that is typically where the donor and the beneficiary are connected. So classic examples of that would be child sponsorship, or staff support, missionary sponsorship, where if I give as a donor, I am basically paired up with, in some way, either directly or indirectly, with the recipient. That has historically been the gold standard of recurring giving. There's been a problem, however, and that is the vast majority of nonprofits are not wired. They don't have the right programming, or they have privacy issues or logistical issues, that they don't have, 100,000 or 10,000, or 1,000, individual beneficiaries that they can somehow pair up with donors. That just doesn't happen, right? And so this has been really the select few organizations that have been able to build a program like this. So let's talk about the second kind of monthly giving program, and that is broadly characterized as membership. And that's where often the donor is the beneficiary of the nonprofit's work. So, for example, your local zoo or museum, or public television, public radio, right? Where the donors are often the same folks that are either receiving directly or indirectly benefits from the nonprofit. And I would also put some content or broadcast ministries, you mentioned, Doug, in a space where there is some element of reciprocal value. I give, but I also receive. I listen to the show, I read the books, I get the magazine, etc. Which is wonderful if you have that. But once again, there's a problem, and that is the vast majority of nonprofits don't have the program model that allows them to provide essentially membership. Often the donor is not the beneficiary. The beneficiary is somewhere else, and the donor is giving to help support the program to the beneficiary. And so membership has not been an option for the vast majority of organizations. In fact, I estimate that between one-to-one sponsorship and membership, that's only about 25% of nonprofits have the ability to do one of those two things. That leaves the third category, which 75% of nonprofits sit in, and that is literally everybody else. So historically, this has been an unfortunate reality in that it's essentially a glorified check writing or EFT giving program. It might have a name, Friends of the Nonprofit, but really ultimately there's no value proposition. It's a checkbox on a form on the website, or it's an occasional appeal to say, hey, would you give to us monthly? But really there's not a lot of reciprocal value. It's not really been historically valuable, and a lot of organizations have just felt capped in their monthly giving capabilities because they just don't have anything that they have to offer. So in terms of percentage, by the way, of monthly giving, I know that'll be a question that I'm sure has been asked or will be asked. That varies, as you can imagine, very widely. These gold standard kind of child sponsorship organizations often see 80 or 90% of their revenue coming from recurring giving. But the vast majority in this everyone else bucket is often in the 20% range, or even lower, 10%, 5% of total revenue. And when we get to some recommendations to get you started, one of the things I want you to look at is what is the percentage of total revenue you have coming in from recurring giving. So we'll get to that in just a little bit. Okay, so that's some bad news. Let's come back to the good news. And then I'll give you some practical examples of what you can look for and then what you can do as you get started. So the good news is that the subscription economy, as I've alluded to before, has changed consumer expectations, which in turn has changed donor behavior. Donors are more likely to become sustainers or to subscribe to services or causes that they prefer. And this is not a new trend. Donors, in a study of millennials donors, when asked, they said 52% of them said they would be more likely to give monthly over a large one-time donation. Now, those of you that are astute fundraisers here on the webinar, which is pretty much everybody, will probably be saying, yeah, Dave, but the main primary giving audiences are still boomers and Gen X donors. Well, let's talk about them. 49% of all baby boomers and Gen X donors said that they were already enrolled in a monthly giving program. I don't know about you, and this is not true for everybody, but if I look at my own personal generosity in our family, that has shifted over the last 10 years to giving episodically, right? Giving as appeals would come, or a newsletter, or a certain need arised, or what have you, with very few nonprofits, typically a church being in that more regular giving bucket. The reality has been that over the last 10 years in our family, we've now prioritized those charities that are the most sort of closest to our hearts, to basically say, why would I wait till December to give them one gift? Maybe if I remember, or, why wouldn't we just faithfully support the organizations that are most important to us? And that decision has been made over and over again over the last 10 years, increasingly by donors, and has been one of the core things that we see driving increases in recurring giving. Charities that are doing sustainers well, these are some of the top charities that are seeing significant, that have invested significantly in their sustainer programs, have seen a 30% growth in the median numbers of monthly donors over the past 5 years. Now, remember, these are the most valuable donors from a retention and long-term value rate you can possibly have. And by the way, spoiler alert, these are not just your $30 donors. Some organizations are seeing donors. I met with one last week or 2 weeks ago that had multiple donors that were getting $5,000 a month because, of course, why wouldn't they do that? And I'm like, on their credit card, they're getting so many points. But the reality is this is not a $30 thing. I know a lot of people, especially those of you that are familiar with things like child sponsorship, think of it as a $30 thing, and it may be for some people. But it is something that people give of their means or of their ability, and it's less about the amount and more about the idea of that commitment and that frequency and that community and those other benefits. In fact, for those of you that are faith-based organizations, this is another bright spot. This was a recent study by Gray Matter Research, the folks over at Infinity Concepts, that found that evangelical Protestants were 27% more likely than donors in general to be part of a monthly giving program with a charity or ministry outside of their church. And so just another bright spot of opportunity there. All this taken together represents what I call subscription philanthropy, which is really this combination of what's been happening in the consumer world that has really changed donor behavior and ultimately caused donors to essentially subscribe to the causes that they care about. And it's really been as I mentioned, a trend over the last several years that has been increasing. If you take just those 75% of organizations that have not been able to do sponsorship or membership type of programs, and you just increased their giving by 5% from individuals over the next 10 years, that's a $116 billion opportunity. So you can imagine why I get excited about this when you're like, okay, if you're a rescue ministry, for example, I've worked with rescue ministries from the beginning of my career. They're near and dear to my heart, but that's a perfect example of this third category of, well, we don't really provide benefits to our donors, and we can't really, for many reasons, do a sponsorship model. So what does that look like? And I think it's organizations like that that stand to gain the most in the subscription philanthropy era that we're in. Okay, so that's really led to this new breed of sustainer giving program, and I'd like to give you an example of how I would define that, and then just some programs to look at, and then we'll move to some quick tips moving forward, and then our Q&A time. And by the way, I think I've seen it in the chat, but there is an opportunity. There's more content that I have today than I'll be able to present, but there is an opportunity to download the deck and including additional content. And so we'll get to that. So this new kind of sustainer program, I call benevolence. And that is really this idea that the donor is not the beneficiary. Typically, the benefits are intangible or limited to the donor. A one-to-one relationship is not possible. And in this case, the value proposition for that program becomes paramount because it's what you're standing or falling on. And it is the most dependent on donor motivation and insights. So and this is a good chat opportunity as I get ready to share some of the examples I'd love for you to take a look at. I'm constantly learning and growing, and so I'd love to hear from you. What are some of the best examples of monthly giving programs that you've seen in your space? Either ones that are directly in your industry, so to speak, your sector, whether that's healthcare or human services or education. What are some of the best monthly giving programs that you've seen in your space that you look to that you think have been really impressive? Human Rights Campaign, that's a good one. So go ahead and keep chatting those in. I'm going to keep us moving for time. But I would love to take a look at those. So I'm going to give you a few. In fact, I see one of them popped up. I'll mention them shortly, actually, to take a look at. So we're going to start with Charity Water. Why not? I think, everybody rolls their eyes a little bit when I bring up Charity Water, but the reality is they've invested heavily in going Sustainer First for years. They have, I think, more than 70,000 monthly givers, and this is exactly that third category. It's not a sponsorship, it's not a membership, there's very little direct benefits you get, and yet they've been able to build a successful growing program. We've had by the way, we had the chief revenue officer for Charity Water on the podcast a couple seasons ago. And so the Spring is the name of their monthly giving program. Highly, highly recommend checking that out. It's very well done. I would call it a pretty mature program. There's always opportunities for growth, but they've really done some good work there. Whoops. We don't want to look at the Charity Water website. Let's get back to our presentation mode. There we go. The second one is International Justice Mission. Their monthly giving program is called Freedom Partners. One of the things I really love about IJM and how they've positioned their program is it really feels like these are the core people who are moving the mission forward at the organization. And this is another example of an organization that has not really, they do talk about gift amounts and sort of minimum gift amounts, but they really let donors choose. And so, for example, I've heard, stories of during major donor or middle and major donor events of, donors raising their hand and saying, yep, I'll give $1,000 a month. I'll give $2,500 a month. And I want to be a freedom partner. Right. And so it's not about small donors. It's about people who want to give faithfully and regularly to support making the mission happen of the organization. So check them out. Flight crew, this was on the list. Tracy, I saw your mention there. So Mission Aviation Fellowship, wonderful nonprofit. And full disclosure, I was on the team that helped to develop this program back at Masterworks, working with Mission Aviation Fellowship folks. And there were really two core insights that led to the development of this program. Number one, donors' just fascination with the aviation part of Mission Aviation Fellowship, and the idea that Mission Aviation Fellowship was really taking the gospel to the ends of the earth. And so the team worked together to create Flight Crew, which is this idea of you are a part of the flight crew. You're a part of taking the gospel around the world, and a lot of different things that were done to evoke that sense of community and that sense of fulfillment. Friends of Focus on the Family, this is another one that I've been involved with off and on over the years that I think is really well done and worth checking out. Partners in Hope, St. Jude's Research Hospital is another program on the more of the healthcare research side of things that I would encourage you to take a look at. That's been well done. And then the last one on the content ministry side of things, I would encourage you to look at Ligonier Ministries, Ministry Partners. And this is an example of I would call it quasi membership, because there are benefits you get. People listen to the program and read the materials and all those sorts of things. But they also talk about, as you can see here, the Ministry Partners as the backbone of our ministry. And so just a couple of examples of organizations to look at. So I'm just going to wrap us up with 3 core next steps, and then we'll go to Q&A. So the first thing I would just say is to take stock of what you have. Someone wise once told me you can't know where you're going until you know where you are. And so a lot of organizations that I talk to, this is the first step, which is how many sustainers do you have? How many have been giving in the last year, for example, and how much did they give? And then I always like to calculate, as I mentioned before, what the percentage of that revenue is against your total revenue. Is that 5%? Is it 50%? Is it 2%? Because that can help you understand kind of what the potential is. And then once again, long-term value is just so critical. Sometimes organizations have a hard time calculating that. That's something that I help organizations do all the time, is take a look at what they have. And that is the last piece is to look at your current, what I would call subscription or subscription adjacent efforts. That just means anything that looks like regular ongoing giving or participation, because those can give you clues as well. Second thing I would do is evaluate your current program. Go on your own user's journey. Something that I do is I evaluate programs. I just did this a couple of weeks ago, is basically do a secret donor project where I, as an outsider, objective outsider, basically come in secretly and become a monthly donor, become a single gift donor, and watch how that journey takes place. And it's amazing the number of times that the journey doesn't match up with the team thought it was. And that's just a reality. I mean, these organizations are complex and things happen and processes change and data, stuff happens. And so that's a thing that I always do. And then talk to your users, listeners, and donors. That's one of the things about the subscription economy, is you actually have to talk to them and understand what really motivates them in order to create a value proposition that really, really matters and will really resonate one of the mistakes that I've seen organizations make is they'll take their single gift offer, the best thing they do in their traditional single gift program, and then they just say, well, can you just give us 12 of those? And spoiler alert, that generally doesn't work. We saw that, I remember, with the rescue missions. Our major offer is provide a meal and care, and so let's just say provide meals and care every month, and it's like that doesn't quite do it. And so you've got to look at that from an ongoing basis. And then the last thing I would say as we wrap up is to think in these terms: design, recruit, and cultivate. So design, meaning most organizations move right to recruit, like, oh yeah, let's just ask for people to give monthly, which, again, I'm not knocking. You need to actually ask, but most people don't realize that they actually have to have a compelling value proposition more than just a single gift offer. But could you give 12 of those, if that makes sense? Recruit in every channel. I have a slide later in the deck that I'll provide in the download that actually rank orders the channels that I see that are generally the most successful in this space. And then when you're cultivating recurring donors, you have to think about more than just ongoing communications. You have to think about retention, upgrading, reactivation strategies. And I have some content as well in the download on that front. Okay, this is a little bonus for you if you want to grab a screenshot, or again, you want to download the PDF, that's totally fine. I know some people come to sessions like this. I saw a lot of questions, Doug, in the registration about, well, what's my frequency? What are some tactics I can use? And I hate that I don't have enough time to go into all this detail, but this would take hours. And so here are some things that I would encourage you to look at just in terms of some quick start tactics in growing your program. So a lot more content weren't able to cover today. Things like, what are the 10 questions to develop your sustainer value proposition, channels, as I mentioned, different incentives that tend to show up in nonprofits. And so more than we were able to cover. But if you'd like, you're welcome to download the presentation. You can either just go to the URL here on screen, imago.consulting/money for ministry, MFM-rethinking-recurring, or, wouldn't be a good presentation without a QR code. You're welcome to go to the QR code. Just FYI, this will get you the download link to download the presentation. It'll also add you to the Wave report, and as Purpose and Profit episodes release, they'll come out. You don't hurt my feelings if you unsubscribe. That's totally fine. If you'd prefer just to get the presentation, you can email me directly. Happy to send that to you. So thank you, guys. Doug, you want to jump to questions?
Yeah, well, let's as we're jumping to questions, and I encourage you, use that Q&A box to put if you did put a question in the chat, Janie on our team will be looking for it and hopefully be able to move it over, but otherwise it's easier for us to find it if it's in that Q&A box. While you're doing that, your poll is going to appear on your screen, and you can, if you want to learn more about how recurring giving can help your planned giving and how planned giving can help your recurring giving, you want to talk to someone from Money for Ministry, you can check that box. If you want to subscribe to the Wave report, and Dave reminded me, you're not going to get subscribed twice. If you click the QR code and check this box, we have a way to filter that out. Or if you just want to get in touch with Dave, or if you just want to make that poll go away, click not at this time, and you'll be able to see the screen full again. So yeah, thanks so much, Dave. As I was listening to you, a couple of questions that came to mind for me, and I wonder how many of our listeners are wondering the same thing. When you talked about some of those programs that are in the other 75%, and when you talked about the benefits, it struck me that the benefits for flight crew and for the International Justice Mission, it was really about belonging. I'm part of this mission, which is that's certainly a great value proposition. It's not bad, but what do you think about? And I think maybe your last slide that we didn't get into maybe have touched on this, but what could we add benefits? Like, would it be? And there's a cost, I realize, but are there annual gifts, or you think of NPR and the mug or the tote bag that you get. I'm not necessarily suggesting that, but is it a newsletter that you get regularly? Is there some kind of annual lunch? Does that work? Does that help? Or is that just a lot of extra activity?
No, and I think it's very natural when you say benefits, especially when I use all the consumer examples. You think, well, then what are the tchotchkes or premiums or things? And by the way, I those, if appropriate to your ministry, especially when they're content centric, copy of the book or what have you, those are actually powerful physical or digital incentives. But mostly incentives are about understanding really what really animates your donors passions, and how can you align that with then what the organization is doing. And so in the case of Mission Aviation Fellowship, at least last I checked, there you don't get anything. You're not getting like a little pilot badge or whatever, although that might be fun. You're getting more very clear direct report backs. You're getting affirmation regularly, stories that actually fit the idea of being a part of the flight crew. And so it's a lot of that. Other incentives, and I have a whole slide on that in the document, can include things like matching gifts. That's such a classic fundraising strategy, but especially for sustainer acquisition or conversion. Those are two terms, by the way, that don't get used very often. We normally say acquisition, but that means a new sustainer out of the gate. Their first gift to you is a sustaining gift. Conversion is a single gift donor that becomes a sustainer. So the benefits are mostly intangible, typically, but it's more about saying, okay, well, what can we talk to our donors and really understand what is a benefit to them emotionally? What is a benefit that keeps them coming back?
Yeah, right. But yeah, that's more challenging than a tangible benefit, but that definitely has value for sure. I'm just curious, as you were talking about subscriptions, one of the things that people put in the chat was they're a nuisance, some of the negatives, that is. I was thinking about our family was a sponsorship, in a sponsorship kind of relationship. And for a variety of reasons, we felt like we needed to get out. And there was a perception that it would be hard to get out. And I guess when I think about like Netflix, what I love about Netflix, if I feel like the family's not watching it, I can cancel it and not tell anybody. And then they start making all kinds of noise when it's canceled, and then they want to subscribe again. But it's so easy. Like you can subscribe, unsubscribe, resubscribe. If a charity made it really easy to get in and out, do you think that would help? Because I think isn't the fear, well, like with these sponsorships, we had to make a phone call. We sat on hold for 10 minutes and we put it off for months. And it's like, I don't want to be part of that because that's a nuisance.
I think this is one area where there actually is a bit of a difference between the subscription economy, and recurring giving, specifically in that, with Netflix, it's like, if I'm not using it, I know I can pause it for a couple months, and so there's a lot more. I have a chart that I used recently. I don't remember the percentages, so I won't quote them, but the number of people that had stopped a subscription in the last 3 months and the number of people that had added a subscription, it was like between 50 and 60%. It was a lot of people. So subscriptions can, in the consumer world, be very churn oriented, and churn is a reality in the nonprofit space. But what I've found is that donors are a little less flaky, for lack of a better term. Once they're committed, they're more committed. And so my encouragement to organizations is don't be shy about making it possible for them to cancel their giving. Now, here's a lesson from the subscription economy. One very prominent nonprofit that has done this well and really embraced it has a process that if you would like to cancel your giving, they offer you first, would you like to just reduce your monthly giving? Like, is this a financial hardship? And if you say, no, I do want to cancel, then they say, well, would you prefer to pause? Like, is this a thing, where you want to pause for 3 months, 6 months, and they have a couple options. So they literally give donors the opportunity to say, hey, maybe you're canceling just because of a momentary situation or because of a giving level issue. So they actually offer some sort of check down opportunities. So that's an example where the subscription economy totally applies. And this organization saves a number of donors, in that way.
Yeah. That reminds me of Audible. That sounds very similar to what I experienced there. It's
very, very uncommon. And then what do you do to reactivate them? That's very common in the single gift world, is of course you have to donors lapse all the time because they gave a single gift and then they didn't give one in the next year or 2 years. And so it's a more mature strategy on the single gift side, but it's something that really for organizations, especially that have had monthly giving for a while, is such a rich source of revenue and donors.
Great. Now, a question here from Tracy, and I like, do membership versus one-on-one giving programs create more of a transactional mindset versus the relationship with donors?
I think with membership particularly, you do see some of that. Like with one organization I worked with, we started to refer to some of their folks, some of their donors, as really ultimately product buyers, because it's like they would give just the minimum amount to get because there was benefits, like, oh, I could get that benefit. And I've certainly given to museums and such to be like, I just need to get the minimum to get the admission and the discount, kind of a deal. And so those folks tend to be more sensitive. But again, if the mission of the organization is education or museum attendance, then I'm like, that's not a problem. Like you're causing people. But yeah, there is an element of tapping into that altruistic sense of, well, I want to help others. But in the case of membership especially, and sometimes with one-to-one, in the case of like staff support, where somebody's giving to help a friend or a family member, those can be more what I would consider transactional, in that they're, if the benefit stops, then they're, probably not going to give.
Yeah. Well, and maybe you've kind of hinted at this, but Tracy had a follow-up. How do you make this membership-based giving program feel more relational? Maybe you don't. Maybe you're saying it's okay. Any thoughts?
Just nothing concrete, but I would say that there's an element, like I said, with, and I think International Justice Mission does this well. They're not over the top. I do get a couple calls. I think it's a couple calls a year, thank you calls. And then I get a very nice, newsletter and cover notes that talk about me as a freedom partner. And those are very affirming and warm. But yeah, they're not trying to be my best friend, kind of a deal. And so that's the interesting thing with community. It's like, and this is still, I'm doing research. I mentioned this. I'm doing a national study of the 9 different verticals of nonprofits and what we can learn, kind of a good to great study. Which incidentally, if anyone's interested, let me know. Or if you have organizations you think I should look at. But this is one of the areas I want to understand more, because community can sound like, oh yeah, we have a social network and everybody just joins it. And it's like, that doesn't happen very often. It's like more the feeling of being a part of the community. And then there are some ways to tap into that.
Wow, our time is fast leaving us. Maybe I have one question I want to ask, and maybe you can give the 10-second response if that's possible. What are the principles you see in subscription philanthropy that are related to and possibly aligned also with planned giving?
Ooh, that fun crossover. I love connecting dots, and when I think about that, I think the first thing that comes to mind is long-term value. Like it's all about long-term value. And I'll have like a seemingly contrary point second. So wait for that in a second. But the first is that it is all about maximizing the relationship and the long-term value with the donor. And so it can be easy to make short-sighted decisions based on today that ultimately hurt tomorrow. And so you have to actually understand the implications to long-term value. Now, the second point, which may sound contradictory, but is not, is that I used to think, and this was one of the things that Money for Ministry helped me learn, was that an investment in planned giving was an investment for a 20-year payback in 20 years. And like, man, I wish I could afford to do that. But in this year's budget, I got to make money now, And one of the things that I learned early on was that actually current giving from donors who, engage with legacy communications actually goes up. And I was like, oh, so this is a today and tomorrow, as well as obviously in the case of estate giving, it's, you often discover gifts that are latent in your file that you just didn't know. And I see the same thing in the work with sustainers. This is not a payback for 5 years from now. This is a payback for this year. And also, by the way, those donors are going to retain at 90+%, and they're going to pay back next year and the year after. And so those would be 2 areas: the importance of long-term value, But the fact that this is not long-term value doesn't mean, in 5 years I'll receive the benefits. It actually typically means an immediate bump, an immediate benefit.
Well, I'm thinking too of your comment about the 25% more in one-time gifts that comes as a result of being a recurring giver. And we say in plan giving that the now giving is oftentimes double that of the rest. So love it, love it. Thank you so much. We need to close our time. We're at the top of the hour here. So grateful for your sharing with us today, Dave, and for what you've brought. And yeah, many of you know at Money for Ministry, our heart is to see the church thrive and flourish in all its forms, and to help ministries like yours deepen relationships, because lives are healed and lives are transformed by the power of the gospel. And it also means deepening relationships empowers the ministry that you're trying to do. So I'd like to close with these words from the Apostle Paul in his letter to his friend and mentee, Timothy. And I think words that capture the heart of our discussion today. So Paul says, but as for you, continue, and I'm really leaning into that continue word, continue in what you've learned and have become convinced of, because you know those from whom you've learned it, and how from infancy you have known the Holy Scriptures, which are able to make you wise for salvation through faith in Christ Jesus. And we pray, Father, that we may be the kind of people who don't just raise money, but who help people everywhere, people who want to do good, be able to continue in what they have learned and become convinced of, so they will be even more wise for salvation through faith in Jesus. Amen. Thank you, Dave. Thanks so much.
Doug. It's been good to be with you, everybody.
Have a good day.